The snow fell in thick, relentless curtains over the small station in Silver Creek, Wyoming territory, turning the world into a blur of white and gray. Clara Whitmore pressed her forehead against the frosted window of the depot building, watching the last stagecoach of the day disappear into the gathering darkness. Her breath fogged the glass, obscuring her view, but it didn't matter. There was nothing left to see. She was alone. The telegram crinkled in her trembling hand. The words seared into her memory, even though the ink had already begun to smear from her tears. Changed my mind. Stop. Do not come. Stop. Find another. Stop. That was it. 3 sentences that had shattered everything. 3 sentences from the man who had promised her a home, a future, a life far from the suffocating confines of Boston and her aunt's endless cruelty. Clara sank onto the hard wooden bench, her worn carpet bag clutched against her chest like a shield. She had sold everything. Her mother's few remaining possessions, her winter coat with the pearl buttons, even the small gold locket that had been her only connection to the father she'd never known. All of it gone, exchanged for a one-way ticket to a man who no longer wanted her. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows in their frames. The pot-bellied stove in the corner of the depot offered meager warmth, its fire burning low. The station master had left an hour ago, muttering something about Christmas Eve dinner with his family, pressing a rusty key into her palm with pitying eyes. "Lock up when you leave," he'd said, not meeting her gaze. "Stage comes back through in 3 days. Maybe you can find your way back east." 3 days. Clara pressed her hand against her empty stomach. She had exactly 47 cents to her name and nowhere to go. The boarding house in town had closed for the holiday, and she couldn't very well knock on strangers' doors on Christmas Eve, begging for shelter like some common vagrant. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and utterly, completely alone in the world. The tears came then, silent and hot, streaming down her cheeks in rivulets that she didn't bother to wipe away. What was the point? There was no one to see her cry, no one to care whether she lived or died in this frozen wasteland at the edge of civilization. Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and let her head fall back against the wall. She would stay here tonight, in this drafty depot building with its hard benches and dying fire. Tomorrow she would figure out what to do. Tomorrow she would find a way to survive. But tonight, on Christmas Eve, she would allow herself to grieve for the life she'd almost had. The fire crackled and popped, sending up a shower of orange sparks. Clara closed her eyes and tried to remember the sound of her mother's voice, the warmth of her embrace, the way she used to sing carols while they decorated their modest apartment with paper snowflakes and strings of cranberries. That had been 10 years ago, before the consumption had stolen her mother away, before Clara had been shipped off to live with Aunt Harriet, a woman who viewed her orphaned niece as little more than an unpaid servant. 10 years of scrubbing floors and mending clothes and enduring constant reminders of what a burden she was. How lucky she should feel to have a roof over her head. When she'd seen the advertisement in the newspaper, mail-order bride wanted by respectable rancher in Wyoming territory, it had seemed like a gift from God, a chance to escape, to build something of her own, to finally matter to someone. How foolish she had been. Clara laughed then, a broken sound that echoed in the empty station. She had traveled 2,000 miles to be rejected by a man she'd never even met. At least Aunt Harriet had known her before deciding she wasn't worth keeping. The wind picked up outside, driving snow against the windows with renewed fury. Clara shivered and looked toward the stove. The fire was nearly out, the coal bin beside it almost empty. She would have to be sparing with what remained if she wanted to survive the night. She rose on unsteady legs and moved toward the stove, her boots leaving damp tracks on the dusty floor. As she reached for the coal scoop, she heard something that made her freeze. Hoofbeats, faint at first, nearly swallowed by the storm, but growing steadily louder. Clara's heart lurched. Who would be riding out in weather like this? The stage was long gone, and surely no sensible person would brave a Christmas Eve blizzard unless they had no choice. She hurried to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. Through the swirling snow, She could just make out a figure on horseback, emerging from the white void like a spectre. The horse was enormous, black as midnight, and its rider sat hunched in the saddle, a dark silhouette against the pale landscape. For a moment, Clara's fear spiked. She was alone, vulnerable, with no one to hear her scream if this stranger meant her harm. Her fingers tightened on the coal scoop, the only weapon within reach. But then the rider dismounted, and she saw him stumble, nearly falling to his knees in the deep snow. He caught himself on the hitching post, his movements stiff and uncertain. Not the movements of a predator, but of a man pushed to his limits by the elements. Clara hesitated only a moment before unlatching the door. The wind struck her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and whipping her hair free from its pins. She gasped, bracing herself against the doorframe as the stranger looked up. Their eyes met through the storm. He was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to block out what little light remained in the darkening sky. His face was obscured by a layer of frost and the brim of his hat, but she could see his eyes, pale and piercing, fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Ma'am," his voice was rough, rasping, barely audible above the howling wind. "Is the station master here?" Clara shook her head, her teeth chattering. "Gone home. For Christmas." The man swayed on his feet, and she noticed then the dark stain spreading across his left side, visible even through the snow crusted on his coat. "Blood. You're hurt," she breathed. He looked down at himself, as if surprised by this observation. Fell off the ridge. Horse slipped. He paused, his jaw tightening. "It's nothing." It was clearly something. Clara had seen enough injured men during her years at Aunt Harriet's, helping tend to the various boarders who passed through, to recognize the signs of serious blood loss. The pallor beneath his weathered skin, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes kept losing focus. This man was dying on his feet, and he didn't even seem to realize it. "Come inside," she heard herself say, stepping back to make room in the doorway. "Please, you'll freeze to death out there." He hesitated, his gaze sweeping over her in a quick assessment that took in her simple traveling dress, her tear-stained cheeks, her evident lack of any male protector. Something flickered in those pale eyes, something that might have been concern. "Are you alone here?" Clara lifted her chin. "Yes." "Does that matter?" A ghost of a smile crossed his frozen features. "Reckon it matters a great deal, but not the way you're thinking." He reached for the hitching post again, steadying himself. "I should see to my horse first. She's been through hell tonight. I can help with that." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and Clara felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't just the intensity of his gaze, though that was considerable. It was the weariness behind it, the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had been alone for far too long. She recognized that look. She saw it every time she passed a mirror. "All right," he said quietly. "I'd be much obliged." Together, they led his horse into the small lean-to attached to the depot building, a makeshift stable that offered at least some protection from the storm. The mare was magnificent, despite her obvious fatigue, all sleek muscle and intelligent eyes. She nuzzled Clara's palm when she reached out to stroke her velvet nose. "Her name's Midnight," the stranger said, pulling a frost-stiffened blanket from his saddlebag. "She's smarter than most people I know." Clara smiled despite herself. "She's beautiful." "She is." He paused, his hand resting on the mare's flank. "I'm Elijah Garrett. Most folks call me Eli." Clara Whitmore." He nodded, as if filing this information away for later consideration. Then he swayed again, catching himself on the stable wall, and the spell was broken. "Inside," Clara said firmly, taking his arm. "Now, before you collapse and I have to drag you through the snow myself." Eli Garrett was heavy. Even leaning on her, putting what she suspected was only a fraction of his weight on her shoulders, he was almost more than she could support. But Clara gritted her teeth and guided him toward the depot building, refusing to let either of them fall. She had been alone all her life. She had been abandoned, rejected, discarded like yesterday's garbage. But she would not let this stranger die on Christmas Eve, not when she had breath in her body and strength in her limbs. It was, she realized with grim humor, the first time in years she'd felt useful for anything. They made it inside just as another fierce gust of wind swept through, slamming the door shut behind them. Clara deposited Eli on the bench nearest the dying stove and immediately went to work, feeding the last of the coal into the fire, coaxing the flames back to life with trembling hands. When she turned back to him, he was watching her with those pale eyes. "You're crying," he said. It wasn't an accusation, merely an observation. Clara touched her cheek, surprised to find it still damp. She'd forgotten about the tears in the chaos of his arrival. "It's nothing." "Doesn't look like nothing." She met his gaze steadily. "I could say the same about that wound in your side." A beat of silence. Then Eli laughed, a short, rough sound that seemed to catch him by surprise. "Fair enough, Miss Whitmore, fair enough." He began unbuttoning his coat with stiff fingers, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured side. Clara moved to help him before she could think better of it, her hands brushing against the frozen leather as she eased it off his shoulders. Beneath the coat, he wore a simple flannel shirt, now stained dark with blood. She could see the tear in the fabric where something, a rock perhaps, or a broken branch, had sliced through both cloth and flesh. "The stove," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll heat some water, and I saw a medical kit behind the counter. The station master must keep it for emergencies." Eli's hand closed around her wrist, gentle but firm. "You don't have to do this." "I know." "Then why?" Clara looked at him, this tall stranger with his frost-bitten face and his weary eyes, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "Because it's Christmas Eve," she said softly, "and nobody should die alone on Christmas Eve." His grip on her wrist loosened, his thumb brushing almost absently across her pulse point. "No," he agreed quietly, "I reckon they shouldn't." She set to work then, moving with an efficiency born of years of practice. The medical kit was crude but adequate, containing bandages, a small bottle of carbolic acid, and a needle and thread that made her stomach clench at the thought of using them. The stove took longer to heat the water than she would have liked, but eventually steam began to rise from the battered kettle. Throughout it all, Eli watched her. He didn't speak, didn't move except to ease his injured body into a slightly more comfortable position, but his eyes followed her every movement with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She had never been looked at like that before, like she was something precious, something worth watching. "This is going to hurt," she warned as she knelt beside him, the basin of hot water balanced carefully on a nearby crate. "I'll need to clean the wound before I can bandage it. I've had worse." "That doesn't make this hurt any less." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his stern features into something almost handsome. "No, I suppose it doesn't." He leaned back, bracing himself against the wall. "Do your worst, Miss Whitmore." She did. To his credit, Eli barely made a sound as she cleaned the jagged gash in his side. He drew in a sharp breath when she applied the carbolic acid, and his jaw tightened when she pressed the clean bandages against the wound, but he remained still and silent, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Clara found herself talking as she worked, filling the silence with words she hadn't meant to say. She told him about Boston, about her mother's death, about the years with Aunt Harriet. She told him about the advertisement, about the hope she'd felt when she'd received her correspondent's husband's first letter, about the long journey west, and finally, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, she told him about the telegram. "He didn't even give a reason," she said, tying off the last bandage with fingers that shook only slightly. "Just changed my mind, as if I were a pair of boots he'd ordered from a catalogue and decided he didn't want after all." Eli was quiet for a long moment, then, "What was his name? Why does it matter?" "Because I want to know who I'm going to beat senseless when I'm healed up enough to ride." Clara's head snapped up. Eli's expression was deadly serious, his pale eyes blazing with a cold fury that sent a shiver down her spine, though not from fear. "You don't even know me," she managed. "I know enough." His voice was low, rough, with something she couldn't identify. "I know you're alone in a blizzard on Christmas Eve because some yellow-bellied coward didn't have the decency to honor his word. I know you could have left me to die in the snow, but instead you opened that door and dragged my sorry carcass inside. And I know you've been crying, Miss Whitmore, and the sound of it is the loneliest thing I've heard in a good long while." Clara's eyes burned. "Mr. Garrett, I'm not sure that's appropriate." "Eli." "What?" "Call me Eli." He shifted, wincing, and reached out to touch her chin with gentle fingers, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. And maybe it's not appropriate. Maybe nothing about this night is appropriate. But I've spent the last 5 years alone on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, talking to nobody but my horse and the occasional mountain lion. And I've forgotten how to be proper. So I'm just going to say what I mean, and you can decide what to do with it. She should have pulled away. She should have stood up, put distance between them, reminded him that they were strangers and this was madness. Instead, she stayed frozen in place, captivated by the warmth in his eyes. "What do you mean, then?" she whispered. "I mean that whoever this man was, he's the biggest fool in all of Wyoming territory. I mean that I've known you for less than an hour, and already I can see you're worth 10 of whatever sorry excuse for a husband he would have made. And I mean that I'm not going to let you spend Christmas Eve alone in this depot, crying over a man who doesn't deserve your tears." Clara felt the hot sting of those same tears threatening to spill over. "You're delirious from blood loss, probably." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, catching a single tear as it escaped. "Doesn't make it any less true." The fire crackled in the stove, sending dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, the storm continued to rage, isolating them from the rest of the world in a cocoon of snow and darkness. Clara became acutely aware of how close they were, of the heat radiating from Eli's body despite his injury, of the calluses on his fingers where they rested against her skin. She had come to Wyoming expecting to find a husband. She had found abandonment instead. And now, here was this man, this stranger, looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. It was too much. It was all too much. Clara pulled back, rising to her feet so quickly she nearly knocked over the basin of water. "You should rest," she said, her voice unsteady. "Sleep, if you can. The storm shows no sign of letting up, and you'll need your strength." Eli watched her retreat with an expression she couldn't read. "And what about you?" "I'll be fine." She busied herself with tidying up the medical supplies, not meeting his eyes. "There's another bench. It's not comfortable, but it will serve. You could share this one." Her hands stilled. "Mr. Garrett." "Eli." "Eli." She forced herself to look at him. "That wouldn't be appropriate. You keep using that word." He settled back against the wall, pulling his coat over his torso like a blanket. "But there's nobody here to see, and it's going to get a lot colder before morning. Body heat's the best way to stay warm." He wasn't wrong. Already Clara could feel the chill creeping back into her bones as the brief warmth from tending his wound faded. Her thin shawl and traveling dress were pitifully inadequate for a Wyoming winter, and the fire could only do so much against the howling wind that found every crack in the depot's aging walls. "I'll stay on my side," Eli added, a hint of amusement creeping into his voice. "Scout's honor." "Were you actually a scout?" "Army. 3 years before the war." His eyes grew distant for a moment, shadowed by memories she couldn't see. "A long time ago." Clara hesitated, reason warring with propriety. But the cold was seeping deeper now, making her teeth chatter, and there was something in Eli's expression that told her he meant what he said. He wouldn't take advantage. He wasn't that kind of man. She didn't know how she knew that, having only met him an hour ago. But she did. "If you try anything improper," she said slowly, "I'll pour the rest of that carbolic acid directly into your wound." Eli's laugh was a warm rumble in the cold room. "Yes, ma'am." She settled onto the bench beside him, keeping a careful distance between their bodies. The wood was hard and uncomfortable, but it was better than the floor, and she was so tired. The emotional exhaustion of the day, the fear, the grief, the unexpected hope, it all came crashing down on her at once, making her eyelids heavy. "Miss Whitmore?" "Clara," she murmured. "If I'm calling you Eli, you should call me Clara." A pause. "Clara, then." He said her name like he was tasting it, rolling it around on his tongue. "Why did you answer that advertisement? What were you hoping to find?" She considered the question, staring at the flickering shadows on the ceiling. "A home," she said finally. "I've never really had one. Not since my mother died. I wanted—" She trailed off, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. "What did you want?" "I wanted someone to belong to." The words came out barely louder than a breath. "I wanted to matter to someone." "Is that foolish?" "No." Eli's voice was soft, rough with emotion. "It's not foolish at all." They lay in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl and the fire pop. Clara felt herself drifting, the warmth from Eli's body slowly seeping into her, despite the space between them. It had been so long since she'd felt truly warm. "I have a ranch," Eli said suddenly. About 20 miles north of here. 200 acres. A decent house, a barn that doesn't leak too badly. It's not much, but it's mine. It sounds lovely. It's lonely. He shifted, and she felt his arm brush against hers. I bought it 5 years ago after my wife died. Clara's breath caught. You were married for 2 years. Elizabeth, Beth. His voice grew heavy with old pain. She caught fever the first winter. Doctor was 3 days' ride away. By the time he got there, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. So am I. Eli was quiet for a moment. I've been alone ever since. Told myself it was what I wanted. Easier not to let anyone close, you know. Can't lose what you don't have. But then I rode into this station, half dead from the cold, and I found a woman crying on Christmas Eve because some fool broke her heart. He turned his head, and even in the dim light she could see the intensity in his gaze. And I thought maybe being alone isn't as safe as I pretended it was. Maybe it's just a different kind of dying. Clara didn't know what to say. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it, and her mouth had gone completely dry. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to feel this pull toward a stranger, this dangerous sense that maybe, just maybe, fate had known what it was doing when it stranded her in this depot on the coldest night of the year. Eli, you don't have to say anything. His hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers threading through hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache. Just don't leave. Please, stay with me tonight. It wasn't a seduction. It was a plea. The desperate request of a man who had been alone too long, reaching out to a woman who understood his isolation, because she had lived it too. Clara squeezed his hand. I'm not going anywhere. His answering exhale was shaky with relief. Good. That's good. She wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe neither of them did consciously, but somehow the distance between them shrank, and then Eli's arm was around her shoulders, drawing her against his uninjured side, and her head was resting on his chest, and she could hear the steady thunder of his heartbeat beneath her ear. He was so warm and solid and real. Sleep, he murmured, his breath stirring her hair. We'll figure out the rest in the morning. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Clara didn't argue. She simply closed her eyes and let herself drift, safe in the arms of a man she barely knew, while the blizzard raged outside and the world disappeared beneath a blanket of white. The morning came slowly, grey and quiet, after the fury of the storm. Clara woke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth, of being held, of not being alone. For a moment she didn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then memory returned in a rush, and she became acutely aware of the hard male body pressed against hers, of the arm draped possessively over her waist, of the soft, even breathing that ruffled her hair. Eli, she should move. She should extract herself from this embrace before he woke, before things became awkward or improper or worse. She should stop thinking so loudly, Eli murmured, his voice rough with sleep. I can hear you from here. Clara's cheeks flushed. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. His arm tightened briefly around her waist before he released her, pulling back to give her space. I've been awake for a while, just didn't want to disturb you. She sat up, smoothing her rumpled dress with hands that trembled slightly. Her hair had come completely undone during the night, tumbling down her back in a tangled mess, and she was certain she looked a fright. But when she risked a glance at Eli, he was looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Wonder. He was looking at her with wonder. You're beautiful, he said softly. In the morning light like this, like something out of a painting. You're still delirious. I'm really not. He pushed himself upright, wincing at the pull on his wound, and reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. I know exactly what I'm saying, Clara Whitmore. You're the most beautiful thing I've seen in 5 years, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Her heart did something complicated in her chest. Eli, let me finish. He took her hand in his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. I know this is sudden. I know we just met, and you had expectations for how your life was going to go, and I'm not what you planned, but I'm asking you to give me a chance. Come to my ranch, just for a visit at first. See if you could be happy there. See if maybe, he swallowed hard, see if maybe there's a future for us that neither of us expected. Clara stared at him. You're asking me to come live with you? A stranger. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that we don't have to be strangers. His grip on her hand tightened. I know what it's like to be alone, Clara. I know what it's like to think no one in the world gives a damn whether you live or die. And last night, lying here with you in my arms, I felt something I haven't felt in a very long time. What? Hope. He said the word like it was sacred. I felt hope. The fire had burned down to embers during the night, leaving the depot cold and grey. But Clara barely noticed. All she could see was Eli, this impossible man who had stumbled into her life at her lowest moment and offered her something she'd given up dreaming of: a home, a future, a place to belong. This is madness, she said quietly. Probably. We could destroy each other. We could. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. Or we could save each other. I'm willing to take that risk if you are. Clara thought of the telegram still crumpled in her pocket. She thought of Aunt Harriet's cruelty, of the long, lonely years stretching out behind her, of the man who had promised her everything and then thrown her away like garbage. Then she thought of Eli's arms around her, warm and strong. She thought of his eyes, pale and piercing, looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. She thought of his voice, rough with emotion, telling her she was beautiful. Yes, she heard herself say. Eli's breath caught. Yes, yes, I'll come to your ranch. Yes, I'll give you a chance. She met his gaze steadily, even as her heart raced. Yes, to all of it. And the smile that broke across his face was like the sun coming out after a storm. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and she felt his whole body shaking with relief. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you, Clara. She wrapped her arms around him carefully, mindful of his injury. Thank me after I've seen this ranch of yours. For all I know, it's a hovel in the middle of nowhere. His laugh rumbled through her. It's definitely in the middle of nowhere, but it's not a hovel. I promise you that much. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other in the grey morning light, while outside the world slowly emerged from beneath its blanket of snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed, everything softened and muted by the thick white covering. Finally, reluctantly, they pulled apart. There was work to be done if they were going to make it to Eli's ranch before nightfall. The horse needed feeding, and Eli's wound needed checking, and they both needed something to eat. As if reading her mind, Eli reached into his saddlebag and produced a slightly stale biscuit and a strip of dried beef. Not much of a Christmas breakfast, he said apologetically, but it'll keep body and soul together until we can reach the ranch. Clara took her portion gratefully, her empty stomach reminding her just how long it had been since she'd eaten. It's perfect. They ate in companionable silence, sitting side by side on the bench while the fire slowly revived. Clara found herself sneaking glances at Eli, still hardly able to believe the turn her life had taken. 12 hours ago, she had been sobbing alone in this very depot, certain that her future held nothing but misery and heartbreak. Now she was preparing to ride off with a man she'd just met, toward a destination she'd never seen, with no idea what awaited her. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt oddly at peace. What are you thinking? Eli asked, catching her looking at him. I'm thinking that yesterday I was the unluckiest woman in Wyoming, and today I might be the luckiest. His expression softened. I'm the lucky one. I rode into that storm half hoping it would kill me, put an end to the loneliness, you know, and instead I found you. Clara's heart clenched. Eli, don't, he shook his head. Don't look at me like that. I'm not saying it for sympathy. I'm saying it because you should know where I was, so you can understand how far you've already brought me. In one night, Clara, one night. And you've given me more reason to live than I've had in 5 years. She reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. Then let's keep living together. He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Together. The ride to Eli's ranch was long and cold, even with the sun emerging to sparkle on the fresh snow. Clara sat in front of him on Midnight's broad back, his arms around her as he guided the mare through the drifts. His injured side must have pained him terribly, but he never complained, never showed any sign of weakness. They talked as they rode, sharing pieces of their histories like gifts on Christmas morning. Clara told him more about her mother, about the little apartment in Boston, where they'd been happy despite their poverty. Eli told her about growing up in Virginia, about joining the army at 17, about meeting Beth at a country dance and falling for her quiet smile. "She would have liked you," he said at one point, his breath warm against Clara's ear. "Beth, she always said I spent too much time alone, that I needed someone to take care of me." "I'm not sure I know how to take care of anyone," Clara admitted. "I've never had the chance." "Then we'll learn together." By midday, they had crossed into Eli's property. Clara gasped when she saw it. The rolling hills, the stands of pine and aspen, the crystal-clear creek winding through the valley like a silver ribbon. And there, nestled against the base of a gentle slope, was the ranch house. It was larger than she'd expected. A proper two-story structure with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney, it looked like something out of a dream. Behind it stood a sturdy barn, and beyond that, she could see the fenced pastures where Eli's cattle would graze in warmer months. "What do you think?" Eli asked, and she heard the vulnerability in his voice. He wanted her to like it, needed her to, perhaps. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Eli, it's absolutely beautiful." His arms tightened around her. "Welcome home, Clara. Home." The words settled into her heart like a warm ember, glowing with possibility. They dismounted in the yard, Eli moving stiffly as his wound protested the hours of riding. Clara immediately took charge, guiding him toward the house, while Midnight waited patiently for her promised rest in the barn. "I can see to the horse," Eli protested. "You can barely walk straight. The horse can wait 10 minutes while I get you inside and look at that wound." He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him otherwise. "Yes, ma'am," he said meekly. The inside of the house was surprisingly comfortable, simple, certainly, and clearly decorated by a man living alone, but clean and warm and welcoming in a way Clara hadn't expected. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, its mantel bare of any ornament. The furniture was rough-hewn but solid, and everything was arranged with a practical efficiency that spoke to Eli's military background. "It needs a woman's touch," Eli said, watching her take in the space. "Beth always said she wanted to make it prettier, but she never got the chance." "It doesn't need to be pretty," Clara replied. "It just needs to be a home." She settled him on the couch by the fireplace and quickly got a fire going, grateful for the woodbox already stacked with seasoned logs. Then she unwrapped his bandages, relieved to find that the wound was beginning to heal rather than showing signs of infection. "You'll live," she announced, applying fresh bandages with gentle efficiency. "I'm glad to hear it." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I've got a lot to live for now." Clara felt heat rise in her face. Even after everything they'd shared, everything they'd confessed in the darkness of the depot, she still wasn't used to his directness, his complete lack of pretense or artifice. "Eli, I know. Too fast, too soon." He dropped his hand with an apologetic smile. "I told you I'd forgotten how to be proper." "It's not that." She sat back on her heels, looking up at him. I don't understand why." "Why me? You could have any woman in the territory, probably. Why would you want a failed mail-order bride with nothing to her name?" Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "Let me tell you something about the kind of man who orders a bride through the mail and then abandons her at a station on Christmas Eve. That's a coward. A man who doesn't know his own mind, who can't commit to anything, who treats people like they're disposable." Whatever excuse he gave himself for what he did, I guarantee it had nothing to do with you and everything to do with his own failings. "You can't know that." "I can, because I've seen you, Clara. I've seen how you face adversity, how you handle crisis, how you treat a stranger with kindness when you had every reason to be afraid. The man who rejected you didn't know what he was getting. He was too stupid or too scared to realize the gift that was being offered to him." Eli reached out and took her hands in his. "But I'm not too stupid, and I'm not too scared. Not anymore. You asked me why I want you. Because in one night, you've shown me more courage and more grace than most people show in a lifetime. Because when I look at you, I see the kind of woman a man spends his whole life searching for. And because when I woke up this morning with you in my arms, I felt something I thought I'd never feel again. What? Clara whispered. Happy. His voice cracked on the word. I felt happy, and I want to keep feeling that way with you for as long as you'll let me. The tears came then, sliding down Clara's cheeks in hot rivers. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, they weren't tears of sorrow or despair. They were tears of hope. Eli Garrett, she said, her voice thick with emotion. If you make me cry on Christmas Day, I'll never forgive you. He laughed, pulling her into his arms and holding her close. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you only cry happy tears. I promise you that. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other before the crackling fire, while outside the snow sparkled in the afternoon sun and the world felt full of possibilities. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustment and discovery. Clara learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and the endless chores, the satisfaction of honest work and the bone-deep exhaustion that followed. She learned Eli's habits, his preferences, his quirks, the way he hummed tunelessly while he worked, the way he talked to midnight like she could understand every word, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and he was smiling a lot these days. You've transformed him, said Mrs. Patterson, the wife of the nearest neighboring rancher, when she came to call on New Year's Day. I've known Eli Garrett for 5 years, and I've never seen him like this. Like what? Clara asked, genuinely curious. Alive. Mrs. Patterson smiled kindly. Before you came, he was like a ghost haunting his own land, going through the motions but never really present. Now look at him. And she nodded toward the window, where Eli could be seen crossing the yard with an armload of firewood, whistling as he walked. That's a man with something to live for. Clara felt the familiar warmth bloom in her chest. He's given me something to live for too. Then you're both blessed. Mrs. Patterson patted her hand. Hold on to that, dear. In this territory, in this life, love like that is rare and precious love. Clara turned the word over in her mind after Mrs. Patterson left. Was that what this was? This fluttering in her chest whenever Eli walked into a room, this ache when he was out on the range and she didn't know when he'd return, this sense of rightness, of completeness, when they sat together by the fire in the evenings, reading or talking or simply enjoying each other's presence. She thought it might be exactly that, but neither of them had said the words, not yet. There was an unspoken agreement between them to take things slowly, to build a foundation of trust and friendship before adding the weight of declarations and promises. Clara was grateful for that. After the disaster with her supposed fiancé, she needed time to believe that this was real. Still, as January turned to February and February to March, she found herself wanting to say it more and more. The first real test came in late March, when the spring thaw turned the roads to rivers of mud, and Eli came down with a fever that left him bedridden for nearly a week. Clara nursed him through it, barely sleeping herself, her fear growing with every hour that passed, without improvement. You should go, Eli rasped on the third day, his face pale and slick with sweat. I don't want you to catch whatever this is. Don't be ridiculous. Clara wrung out a cool cloth and laid it across his forehead. I'm not going anywhere. Clara! No! Her voice was sharp enough that his eyes widened in surprise. I told you on Christmas Eve that nobody should die alone. Do you think I meant that just for strangers? Do you think I'm going to leave you now, after everything? He was quiet for a moment. Then, weakly, you're bossy when you're scared. I'm bossy all the time. You're just too fevered to notice most days. A ghost of a smile crossed his cracked lips. I noticed. Good. Now stop talking and rest. You're going to get better. And that's not a request. Somehow, impossibly, he obeyed, and by the end of the week, the fever had broken. Clara wept with relief when she saw the color returning to his cheeks, when she heard him asking for food, with something like his normal appetite. Told you, she said, helping him sit up against the pillows. I told you you'd get better. You ordered me to get better. His hand found hers on the blanket. That's not quite the same thing. It worked, didn't it? His answering laugh was thin but genuine. I'm starting to think you could order the sun to rise and it would obey. Don't test me. Never. When he was strong enough to get out of bed, Eli insisted on coming downstairs for dinner despite Clara's protests. She set up a comfortable chair for him by the fire and prepared the heartiest meal she could manage from their stores. A thick beef stew with fresh bread and the last of their stored apples for dessert. This is delicious, Eli said around a mouthful of stew. When did you learn to cook like this? Years of practice. Aunt Harriet was particular about her meals. Aunt Harriet sounds like a miserable old crone. Clara laughed despite herself. She is. I hope I never see her again. You won't. Eli's tone was surprisingly fierce. Not as long as I'm alive. Anyone who treated you that way has no place in your life. She looked at him. This man who had come into her life like a storm and rearranged everything. His face was still thin from the fever, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but there was a fire in them that made her heart race. Eli, I mean it, Clara. He set down his spoon and reached for her hand. You've spent your whole life being made to feel like a burden, like you didn't matter, but you matter to me. You matter so much. It scares me sometimes. It scares me too, she admitted quietly. Good, then we're scared together. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles, the way he had that first morning in the depot. I don't ever want you to feel unwanted again. Not here, not with me. I don't. The words came easily, because they were true. I haven't felt unwanted since you wrapped your arms around me on Christmas Eve. I've felt cherished, protected, like I finally found the place I was always meant to be. Something shifted in Eli's expression. His eyes went soft and warm in a way she'd never seen before, and his grip on her hand tightened almost convulsively. Clara. His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. I need to tell you something. Her heart stuttered. What is it? He pulled her closer until she was perched on the edge of his chair, her face inches from his. She could see every detail of his features. The strong jaw, the slightly crooked nose, the pale eyes that had haunted her dreams since the moment they'd first met. I love you. He said it like a prayer, like a confession, like the most important words he'd ever spoken. I love you, Clara Whitmore. I've loved you since I opened my eyes in that depot and saw you standing there like an angel, ready to save my sorry life. I've loved you every day since. And I'll love you every day until I die. I just needed you to know. Clara felt the tears coming and didn't try to stop them. Eli, you don't have to say it back. I know it's soon. And I know you've been hurt. And I know you have every reason not to trust someone saying these things. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just couldn't keep it inside anymore. She took his face in her hands, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palms, the warmth of his skin. You absolute fool, she said softly, his brow furrowed. What? I love you too. The words hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Eli stared at her like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. You do? I do. Clara laughed through her tears. I love you, Eli Garrett. I love your stubbornness and your kindness and your ridiculous conversations with your horse. I love the way you look at me like I'm something precious. I love the way you held me through the storm and promised me a home. I love you, all of you, and I don't care if it's too fast or too soon or any of the other sensible objections I should probably be making. Clara. Her name came out broken, reverent. Clara. And then he was kissing her. It was nothing like Clara had imagined her first kiss would be. It was better, infinitely, impossibly better. His lips were soft against hers, tentative at first, asking permission, then growing bolder when she responded in kind. His hands came up to cradle her face, holding her like she was made of glass, and she felt herself melting into him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it would burst. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Eli rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I've wanted to do that since Christmas Eve, he admitted. Why didn't you? Because you were scared and hurt, and I didn't want to take advantage. He opened his eyes, and she was lost in their depths. Because you deserved to be courted properly, not grabbed by some half-dead stranger in a depot. I wouldn't have minded being grabbed. His laugh was warm and intimate. I'll keep that in mind for the future. Future. The words sparkled with promise. Speaking of the future, Clara said slowly, what happens now? Eli pulled back slightly, his expression turning serious. That's up to you. I told you when we arrived that this was just a visit, that you could leave any time you wanted. That offer still stands. If you've seen enough of life on the ranch and decided it's not for you, I'll take you to town myself, help you get wherever you want to go. Is that what you want? God, no! The words came out fierce and immediate. What I want is for you to stay. Forever. What I want is to marry you and spend the rest of my life making you happy. But what I want doesn't matter if it's not what you want to. Clara considered him, this man who had given her everything and asked for nothing in return, who had opened his home and his heart to a stranger on the worst night of her life, and never once made her feel like a burden. "Ask me," she said quietly. "What?" "Ask me properly. The thing you want." Understanding dawned in his eyes. He shifted, wincing slightly as his still healing body protested, and took both her hands in his. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice shaking only slightly, "will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my home? Will you let me spend the rest of my days loving you, taking care of you, building a life with you in this beautiful, terrible, wild place?" She could barely see him through her tears. "Yes, yes, yes. 1,000 times, yes." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and she felt his shoulders shaking with emotion. They clung to each other for a long time, laughing and crying and murmuring the same 3 words over and over like a prayer. "I love you, I love you, I love you." Outside, the spring sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Inside, 2 people who had been alone for far too long finally found the thing they'd been searching for: home. The wedding took place in May, when the wildflowers were blooming and the whole territory seemed to burst with color and life. It was a small affair, just the Pattersons and a few other neighboring ranchers, plus the preacher from Silver Creek, who had made the journey specially for the occasion. Clara wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her alter from one of her own, with wildflowers woven through her hair and her mother's gold locket around her throat. She had thought the locket was lost forever, sold to fund her ill-fated journey west, but Eli had tracked it down somehow, found the pawnbroker she'd sold it to, and bought it back. "Every woman should have something from her mother on her wedding day," he'd said when he gave it to her, and Clara had cried so hard she'd soaked his entire shirt front. Now, standing before the preacher with Eli's hand warm in hers, she felt her mother's presence like a blessing. "Look at me, Mama," she thought. "I found someone who loves me. I found a home." The vows were simple and traditional, nothing fancy or elaborate. But when Eli said, "I do," the words rang with such conviction that Clara's knees nearly buckled. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." Eli's grin was blinding. "Finally," he murmured, and pulled her into his arms. The kiss was thorough and enthusiastic enough to earn scandalized giggles from Mrs. Patterson and a whoop of approval from one of the ranch hands. Clara didn't care. She was lost in the moment, in the feel of her husband, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. When they finally broke apart, Eli kept his arm around her waist, anchoring her to his side. "Mrs. Garrett," he said, testing the name. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." The celebration afterward was modest but warm. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a feast, and someone had produced a fiddle, and before long the small group was dancing and laughing beneath the stars. Clara danced with Eli until her feet ached and her cheeks hurt from smiling, then collapsed beside him on the porch steps to catch her breath. "Happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Deliriously." "Good." He pulled her closer, tucking her against his side. "Because I plan to keep making you happy for the next 50 years at least." "Only 50? 60 then, 70, if we're blessed." Clara laughed and tilted her face up for another kiss. "I'll hold you to that." The last of the guests departed well after midnight, leaving Clara and Eli alone in the house that was now truly theirs, together forever. "I should carry you over the threshold," Eli said thoughtfully, as they stood in the yard, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. "Isn't that the tradition?" "You'll hurt your side." "My side is fine." To prove it, he swept her up in his arms with a smoothness that made her squeak with surprise. "See? Perfectly fine." "Eli!" "Hush! Let me do this properly for once." He carried her through the front door, kicking it shut behind them, and didn't set her down until they reached the bottom of the stairs. His eyes were dark in the lamplight, intense with an emotion that made Clara's stomach flip. "I love you," he said softly. "I don't think I'll ever get tired of saying that." "I'll never get tired of hearing it." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, a promise of things to come. When they finally parted, Clara found herself trembling, though not from cold. "Upstairs?" Eli asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He took her hand and led her up the stairs to the bedroom they would now share. The room had been transformed while she wasn't looking. the bed made up with fresh linens, candles flickering on every surface, and a small bouquet of wildflowers on the nightstand. "When did you do this?" "While you were getting ready this morning." He looked almost shy. "I wanted it to be special. Our first night as husband and wife." Clara's heart swelled. "It's perfect. Everything is perfect." They stood there for a moment, suddenly awkward despite all the time they'd spent together. All the kisses and confessions and shared vulnerabilities. This was different. This was the beginning of something new, something sacred. "We can just sleep," Eli said softly. "If you're not ready, there's no rush." Clara shook her head. "I'm ready. I want this. I want you." His answering smile was tender enough to make her ache. "Then come here, wife. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." She went to him, and the rest of the night dissolved into whispered words and gentle touches, and a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Eli was infinitely patient, infinitely tender, treating her body like something precious, and her pleasure like his primary concern. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together in the candlelight, hearts still racing and skin still warm, Clara understood for the first time what it truly meant to be cherished. "I never knew it could be like that," she whispered. Eli pressed a kiss to her hair. "Neither did I. Not really. Not until you." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and Clara's dreams were filled with wildflowers and sunshine and the sound of children's laughter echoing across the hills. The summer passed in a golden haze of hard work and simple pleasures. Clara threw herself into ranch life with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself. Learning to ride, to rope, to mend fences and tend cattle. She discovered muscles she didn't know she had, and developed calluses on her hands that would have horrified Aunt Harriet. She had never been happier. Eli watched her transformation with undisguised pride. "You're a natural," he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire. "I've seen ranch-born women who don't take to this life as well as you have. I had good motivation." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "For the first time in my life, I have something worth working for." He corrected gently. "We have something worth working for." She smiled and threaded her fingers through his. When fall arrived, bringing cooler weather and the hard work of preparing for winter, Clara began to notice changes in her body. Tiredness that seemed to come from nowhere, a persistent queasiness in the mornings, a sensitivity to smells that made certain chores almost unbearable. She tried to hide it at first, not wanting to worry Eli until she was certain, but he knew her too well now, had memorized every expression on her face and every nuance of her mood. "Something's wrong," he said one morning, finding her sitting on the edge of their bed, pale and shaky. "Tell me." "Nothing's wrong." She took his hands, guiding them to rest on her still flat stomach. "Everything is exactly right." Understanding dawned slowly. She watched it cross his face, the confusion giving way to hope, then to wonder, then to a joy so intense it stole her breath. "Clara." Her name came out strangled. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that come spring, there's going to be a new addition to this ranch. A small one." Eli dropped to his knees before her, his hands still pressed against her belly. "A baby," he breathed. "We're going to have a baby. Unless there's another explanation for all this, yes." He looked up at her with tears streaming down his face, and Clara felt her own eyes fill in response. After Beth, I never thought I'd have another chance at this. A family, a real family." "Neither did I." She cupped his face in her hands, wiping away his tears with her thumbs. "But here we are." He pulled her down into his arms, holding her with a careful tenderness that made her laugh and cry at the same time. "I love you so much. Both of you. All of you. We love you too." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other on the edge of the bed, dreaming of the future that was growing between them. Winter came hard that year, fiercer than any Clara had experienced since her first Christmas in Wyoming. But this time, she wasn't alone in a cold depot, crying over a man who had abandoned her. This time, she was safe and warm in her own home, surrounded by love, watching her belly grow round with new life. Eli doted on her shamelessly. He refused to let her do any heavy lifting, insisted she rest whenever she looked tired, and spent hours talking to the baby through her stomach, telling their unborn child about the ranch and the horses and the beautiful mother who was carrying them. "You're ridiculous," Clara told him, after one particularly long, one-sided conversation about the best way to saddle a horse. I'm thorough. Our child should be educated from the start. They won't remember any of this, maybe not consciously, but I believe children know when they're loved. Even before they're born. He pressed a kiss to her belly. And this one is going to be the most loved baby in all of Wyoming territory. Clara couldn't argue with that. Christmas Eve came cold and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Clara stood at the window, watching the moonlight play across the snow, her hand resting on her swollen stomach. What are you thinking about? Eli asked, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her. This time last year, I was alone in that depot, certain my life was over. And now, she turned in his arms, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. Now I have everything I ever wanted. A husband who loves me, a home of my own, a baby on the way. Her voice cracked with emotion. I thought being left at that station was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, but it led me to you, so maybe it was actually the best. Eli kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. I thank God every day that fool stood you up. If he'd been a decent man, if he'd kept his word, I never would have found you. You found me half dead from the cold and the fall, and you saved me. In every way that matters. His hand came up to cover hers on her belly. I was dying out there, Clara, not just from the injury. I'd been dying for years, alone on this ranch with nothing but ghosts for company. You brought me back to life. We brought each other back. We did. He pulled her closer, resting his chin on top of her head. Merry Christmas, Clara Garrett. She smiled against his chest. Merry Christmas, Eli. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft and gentle, blanketing the world in white. Inside, two people who had once been lost held each other close, grateful beyond measure for the storm that had brought them together and the love that had kept them whole. Spring arrived with the birth of their daughter. Emma Grace Garrett came into the world on a bright March morning, squalling at the top of her tiny lungs. She had her father's pale eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and from the moment Eli held her for the first time, he was utterly, completely devoted. She's perfect, he breathed, cradling her against his chest with exquisite care. Clara, look at her. She's absolutely perfect. Clara, exhausted but elated, reached out to stroke her daughter's downy head. She is. She really is. Hello, little one, Eli murmured, his voice rough with emotion. I'm your daddy. I've been waiting a long time to meet you. Emma's response was a tiny yawn that showed off her toothless gums. Eli laughed, tears streaming down his face, and Clara had never loved him more than she did in that moment. Thank you, he said, looking up at her with eyes that shone. Thank you for her, for this, for everything. Thank you, she replied, for finding me, for keeping me, for giving me a reason to believe in happy endings. He leaned over to kiss her. Their daughter nestled safely between them. This isn't an ending, Clara. This is just the beginning. She smiled through her tears. I know. I can't wait to see what comes next. What came next was a life fuller and richer than either of them had dared to imagine. There were hard times, of course, winters that seemed endless, and summers that scorched the earth, and all the small catastrophes that came with running a ranch and raising a child. But through it all, they had each other. They had love. 2 years after Emma's birth, their son arrived. Thomas Elijah Garrett, named for Clara's father and his own, came into the world during an autumn thunderstorm, as if announcing to the world that he intended to make his presence known. He had Clara's dark hair and Eli's stubborn jaw, and from his first breath he was the apple of his father's eye. Now we have one of each, Eli said, cradling his newborn son, while Emma pressed close to his leg, peering up at her new brother with curious eyes. A perfect match set. Don't get any ideas about more, Clara said, exhausted but smiling. 2 is plenty. 2 is perfect, he agreed. But there was a gleam in his eye that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The years rolled by like tumbleweeds across the plains, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Emma grew into a spirited young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's quiet strength. Thomas became a natural rancher, taking to the land and the animals with an ease that made Eli proud enough to burst. The ranch prospered under their care. What had once been a lonely spread, run by a single grieving man, became a thriving enterprise. known throughout the territory for its fine cattle and fairer dealings. Neighbors who had once worried about the solitary rancher to the north now counted the Garretts among their dearest friends. And through it all, Clara and Eli's love only deepened. The passion of their early days matured into something richer, stronger, built on years of shared struggles and triumphs. They still held hands when they walked, still stole kisses when they thought the children weren't looking, still looked at each other across crowded rooms and felt their hearts skip a beat. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. The children were grown now. Emma married to a kind schoolteacher from town. Thomas running more and more of the ranch operations himself. Stopping at that station, taking in a strange woman with nothing but a carpet bag and a broken heart. Eli turned to look at her. His once dark hair now shot through with silver, his face weathered by decades of Wyoming weather, but still handsome to her eyes, still the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Every day," he said gravely, "I regret that I didn't find you sooner." She laughed and swatted his arm. "Flatterer. It's only flattery if it isn't true." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Clara Garrett, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me a reason to live when I'd forgotten I had one. You gave me children and laughter, and a home that's actually a home instead of just a house. There isn't a single moment of the last 20 years I would change, because every one of them led to this, to us, to right now." Clara felt her eyes prick with tears, the same way they had that first Christmas Eve when a stranger had looked at her like she was worth something. Some things, it seemed, never changed. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," he replied. "More than words can say, more than I could ever show you, though I'll keep trying until my last breath." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to rose to purple, their fingers intertwined the way they had been since that snowy night so long ago. And every year, on Christmas Eve, they would sit together by the fire, their children and later their grandchildren gathered around them, and tell the story of how they met. How a lonely cowboy rode into a blizzard expecting to die and found an angel waiting for him instead. How a mail-order bride, abandoned and heartbroken, opened her door to a stranger and found her destiny. How two people who had given up on happiness discovered that sometimes the universe knows exactly what it's doing, and they lived happily ever after, the little ones would ask, their eyes wide with wonder, clutching mugs of warm cider and hanging on every word. "They lived happily ever after," Clara would confirm, meeting Eli's gaze across the crowded room and seeing her own joy reflected there, forever and always. Emma would smile at her husband, remembering how nervous she'd been to tell her parents she'd fallen for a man who wasn't a rancher. Thomas would squeeze his wife's hand, grateful beyond measure for parents who had taught him what real love looked like. And Eli would pull Clara close, pressing a kiss to her silver-streaked hair, and whisper in her ear the same thing he'd whispered every Christmas Eve since that first one. "Best decision I ever made. Stopping at that station, finding you. Best decision I ever made," she would whisper back, opening that door. Outside, the snow would fall gently over the ranch, the same snow that had blanketed the world the night they'd met. Inside, surrounded by the family they'd built and the love they'd nurtured, two people who had once been broken and alone would hold each other close and count their blessings. Because sometimes life's greatest gifts come wrapped in its darkest moments. Sometimes being left behind leads to being found, and sometimes a lonely cowboy and a crying bride are exactly what each other needs. Clara had come to Wyoming territory looking for a home. She had found so much more. She had found love. She had found family. She had found her purpose. She had found forever, and that more than anything else was the truest happy ending of all. Forever and always, the end.